Namaskar and welcome to India Diplomacy, show on India's national broadcaster Doordarshan about Indian foreign policy, India's international relations and how India has contributed to global prosperity and international security. Viewers, in this episode, we are taking a close look at the long durée of India's economic greatness, fall, and then its return to greatness. This is over almost 2 millennia. So we are going to be looking at the rise, fall, and again the return to rise of India's economic juggernaut and how it has shaped the world. And to discuss this, I have with me a very distinguished economist, writer and commentator who has worked for international and Indian financial firms and has written 2 major books. His latest book is called India Reborn. This is a new title with the subtitle, The Epic Story of Civilization's Rebound from 2 Centuries of Decline. So let me please welcome Prasenjit Basu to my show.
Good to be here.
Prasenjit ji, this work starts with a very, startling statistic, which is India was the dominant or the most powerful, largest economy in the world at the beginning of the Christian era. And it remained so for almost 1600 years until the 1700 or so roughly, you show using Angus Madison's statistics. And so it almost feels like a dream because ever since there has been an interregnum and, we fell into abject condition. But that glorious era from the ancient past, what were our ancestors doing in terms of manufacturing? You've also mentioned that India was the greatest trading power in the world at the time, ahead of the China or the West or even the Arab countries or any other empire. So tell our audiences what made India such a dynamic economic powerhouse in that era, and what were we actually producing for the world and what was the world buying? Many of us remember Vikramaditya of Ujjain around that time, attributed to saying that India was Sone ki chidiya, or was a golden bird. And Pliny, the Roman historian, was writing around that time, the turn of the first millennium, that all the world's gold was being drained, and that India was absorbing all the gold and was selling its products. So what were these products and services that our ancestors were so good at manufacturing, and why were we the world leaders?
Well, throughout history, we were the clothier to the world. So we were making the clothes that the world really wanted. That was one very important aspect. And we also were the greatest shippers. Through most of history, we built the greatest ships and we used those ships to trade with the world. And our influence spread. The evidence of our influence in the East is still there. You go to Angkor Wat, you go to Vietnam, central and southern Vietnam was the Champa Empire, which lasted from 192 AD until 1462. So, and it was Hindu. So all of this, and then in fact, even prior to this 2000-year period, you go back to about 1000 BC, there was a treaty signed between the Mitanni and the Hittite people in the name of Indra and Varuna. So, and they were in what is now Syria. So you see, throughout history, we have had this enormous influence because we had the most open economic system. We had the most open thinking. If you look at our Vedas and all our Shastras, Smritis and Sritis and everything else, you notice that it was open to ideas. It was open to challenge. There was constant challenge of existing ideas, and that created the environment for a very successful economic system, a very successful and dynamic overall economy, and not just economy, it was a polity that was dynamic as well, that had a huge influence on the world around it.
Yeah. Well, so from there, we start moving forward in time, as your book does, and there you start encountering challenges and problems, the foremost being the Islamic invasions and the conquest of India, the sultanates, and then the Mughal rule. So from around 1000 Christian era, you show that there were a lot of devastating and rapacious attacks and plunder of India by these invaders from the northwest. And yet the point you make, which is important, is that at least until 1700 or so, we still remain number one in the world in terms of our contribution to world output and GDP. So how did India sustain this primacy in the global economy despite being brought under the Islamic yoke?
You see, in the 730 AD, around 736 or so, is when Muhammad bin Qasim reached Sindh. But the interesting thing is that there was a long 300-year period during which they were pushed back. So, and then between Mahmud of Ghazni and the arrival and the beginning of the Delhi Sultanate is another 200-year period. So, the important thing is that unlike other civilizations, if you look at the civilizations of, say, Persia, Egypt, the Byzantine Empire, these were crushed and they ceased to exist. So the Romans, for instance, ceased to exist. The Egyptians ceased to exist. And the Persian Empire only existed in India because the Zoroastrians had to flee Persia and settle in Gujarat. Now, on the other hand, we actually fought back. So one thing is that we fought back. The second thing is that even after the conquest of northern and eastern India and some parts of central India, there was a big redoubt in the south. So Vijayanagar, at the time that Babur arrived, Babur's was not the largest and most prosperous Indian empire. By far the much bigger one was Vijayanagar. And the Europeans came to Vijayanagar, in fact. The Domingo Pais and so on, the Portuguese travelers, they arrived in Vijayanagar and they were awestruck by the fact that Vijayanagar's capital was a much more prosperous city than the greatest cities in Christendom at the time.
Under Krishna Deva Raya.
So Krishna Deva Raya was then ruling, and he was, the interesting thing about Krishna Deva Raya, he was a polymath. He was writing novels and poetry and really high quality stuff, as well as ruling over an incredibly prosperous kingdom that had expanded to the whole of peninsular India. So now, the interesting thing is that unlike the other civilizations, we continued to survive and prosper through the periods of Islamic conquest. And the Islamic rulers in India, the difference is that unlike the British, they did not make India a colony. The difference between what the British did in India and what the Islamic conquests did was two things. One, the Islamic conquests, the conquerors settled in India. So the wealth that they built up circulated within the country and was largely reinvested here. Of course, there was some initial years during which a lot of wealth was transferred back to their homelands. But if you just think about the so-called Mughals or Timurids, they had moved here. They could go back to places like Persia.
So there was
but they couldn't go back to their homeland. They couldn't really go back to their homeland because their homeland was lost. By the time they arrived in India, they had lost their homeland, so they couldn't really go back there. Whereas the British were looting. They came to loot, and the loot was enormous. I mean, the difference was that when the British were looting India, I just give you one small example. There was a Bengal famine, 13 years after the Battle of Palashi. There was a famine in Bengal in 1770. It lasted about 2 years, 1770 to 1772. It killed 1/3 of the population of this great province of Bengal that includes what is today Bihari and Orissa and so on. And the result of that was that the gold flowing back to the British Empire had started declining in 1772 and 1773 in particular. it had declined to about half of what was going there in 1770. And so there was a severe recession, almost a depression in the British Empire.
Let me take you up on the empire question a little deeper now, the British Empire. Now, your book is subtitled 2 Centuries of Decline. Now, those 2 centuries, 18th and 19th, and part of the 20th century, that is the period where obviously there was loot and scoot. You mentioned that, and they were plundering and taking away the resources in order to build the industry and the prosperity of Europe. So, you have actually mentioned one economist, Utsa Patnaik's figure of $45 trillion equivalent from India that was drained out of India by the British. There is an Oxfam report from 2025 that says it's probably like 65 trillion or something like that. What exactly you think? I mean, the reparations debate, has been stalled because we have never really officially asked for money back from the UK. But what is your estimate of how much we lost economically from the British period, in terms of our total wealth?
Well, you see, I think the important thing is to understand that Britain gained and India lost. There are 2 aspects to this. Now, if you look at Portugal and Spain, when the parts of the world that they conquered, they found a lot of commodities. They found gold and silver and so on. And so, a lot of gold and silver from Latin America arrived in their homelands. It caused their currencies to appreciate relative to others. And that caused a kind of deindustrialization. There was no industrial growth there. Whereas, when the British came to India, they found the most industrialized country on earth. So, what they decided is they banned, about 50 years before the Industrial Revolution, they banned imports of cloth and clothes from India. So, it took 50 years of import substitution and protection before this actual substitution of imports began with the Industrial Revolution. And if you look at 1813, 53 years after the supposed start of the Industrial Revolution, Britain was still imposing an 80% tariff on cloth coming from India. So, as late as 50 years after the Industrial Revolution, the British, the Lancashire textile industry was still uncompetitive. So uncompetitive that they had to impose an 80% tariff. Now, so the important thing is, of course, there was a massive drain. But the other aspect is also worth knowing, which is that Britain prospered by banning, so today we think of free trade as being the panacea for everything. But in fact, the British invented import substitution based on protection, severe protection, a complete ban, followed by very high tariffs. So that is that is one side. The other side is, I start with, after the Battle of Plassey, Mir Jafar gave a gift to the 16 members of the Bengal Council. The cash gift was worth more than the total earnings of the 400 richest landholders in Britain that year, including the king. So the king and the 400 largest landholders earned 24 million pounds that year. The gift given by Mir Jafar to the 16 members of the Bengal Council was 25 million pounds, plus he gave the 24 parganas to Robert Clive. So, and then the loot just continued. So the Industrial Revolution in Britain was financed by the loot from India, which is something that economic history in the West still does not acknowledge. They just talk about innovations, Cartwright spinning jenny and so on, being the reason for the Industrial Revolution.
Scientific discoveries, yeah.
Scientific discoveries were made possible. They were financed by the wealth generated from the loot of India. This is the important story that the West needs to start acknowledging. They never do.
Right. Huge historical reckoning still to be made about colonial era destruction and exploitation. Prasenjit ji, you are moving forward. I mean, one of the ironies is that even after we achieved independence in 1947, you've shown in the later part of the book that we still grew at a very snailish pace, and at that time it was derided as the so-called Hindu rate of growth and all that. And you talked about a colonial bureaucratic control mindset that our elites, post-independence elites, inherited from the British and continued some of those practices. So even though we were politically free, we lost a lot of decades with very high poverty levels that were not reduced. And you actually show that compared to the global averages, India's per capita income actually was relatively even declining after independence, many decades after independence. So that Nehruvian era you have critiqued, rightly so, and shown that it was a highly misguided. But how come it persisted for so long, 1947 to the 1990s? Why is it that our economic revival did not start at the time?
Well, the interesting point is that in 1750, we were nearly 25% of world GDP. By 1947, our share of world GDP had declined to 4.5%. And by 1990, it had declined to 3%. So there was a continued decline from 1947 to 1990, a further decline. And the reason is because we did not achieve economic independence or freedom until 1991. And the reason for that is simple. I mean, first of all, we had a dirigist system. We had a very control-based bureaucracy. The bureaucracy was created by the British in order to control India. On top of this colonial bureaucracy based on control, we tried to impose a Stalinist economy. And, we tried to become a heavy industry-based economy right from the start at a time when we had no real training. We had we didn't have the engineers, technicians, etc., to adopt and absorb that technology. And so we completely failed. The other aspect is we failed really in two areas where we had comparative strength. One is clothes and cloth. So labor-intensive manufacturing was our strength at the time of Megasthenes. When Megasthenes visited Chandragupta Maurya, he marveled at the clothes that India was producing, and those clothes were in fact already clothing the world. But between 1947, even in the First and Second World War, there was a boom in Indian textiles. But when the Korean War happened in the early 1950s, it wasn't India that benefited, it was Japan. And the reason for that was because we had become more dirigist already by then, became much more so after the 1956, and that held the economy back. It held our agriculture back also because we had the state-based approach, and failed land reforms made it even worse. The interesting thing is that all the reforms, the first reform that was really important in India was the Green Revolution, which was brought in by Lal Bahadur Shastri ji during his very brief prime ministership. He was only prime minister for a year and a half, but during that period, he brought in the tremendous institutional changes that instigated and started the Green Revolution, which has had a significantly positive impact. Now, then the other reforms, interestingly, all the important reforms in India were brought in by outsiders to the English-speaking elite.
I want to bring some context for the audience as well on this. Prasenjit Basu says in his book that the outsiders who were not part of the Anglicized elites were responsible for India's economic revival. He already mentioned Lal Bahadur Shastri, but after the 90s, once the privatization and the reforms and the freeing up of the economy started, we had PV Narasimha Rao, we have Atal Bihari Vajpayee, and as we speak, Narendra Modi, the era of Modi continues. And he says that these are the architects of India's economic revival after centuries of decline. So essentially, economic freedom only started almost 50 years after the political freedom. And so this contemporary period, especially these figures, Prasenjit, what is the link between people, our political leaders who came from the grassroots, and this, the return of India's pathway to greatness as a world economic powerhouse. I mean, why does it have to be these kind of leaders as opposed to the Anglicized and the Westernized ones? So what is the difference between these prime ministers and the previous ones that we could see this finally, after millennia, India is rising again as an economic power?
Well, you see, Jawaharlal Nehru was educated in England from high school onwards. So he was not part of the soil of India at all. And unfortunately, he continued the British system almost completely. We still see that in Lutyens, Delhi. The British-built bungalows were occupied by the new English-speaking elite, and they looked down upon the so-called
hoi polloi.
The hoi polloi. They called them the great unwashed. And there was a big disconnect between this Anglicized elite and the rest of the country. Unfortunately, as a result, Nehru continued the system. Indira Gandhi probably deepened it and made it worse with her socialism. Now, the difference is that once people like Lal Bahadur Shastri, PV Narasimha Rao, they were men of the soil. They were much more rooted in the soil of India. And even Morarji Desai, even during the just over 2 years, Morarji Desai's 2-year prime ministership resulted in a real GDP growth of 6.5% a year, which was the fastest 2-year growth.
At that time,
until
a miraculous thing.
So even then, you see, now they brought in just some subtle, some much larger changes. So PV Narasimha Rao brought in enormous changes, but they were also pushed by the IMF. It's important to understand that the major reforms that Finance Minister Manmohan Singh brought in were all pushed by the IMF. The industrial reforms, total delicensing, was done by Narasimha Rao himself, who was his own industry minister. And then subsequent to that, Vajpayee ji, two really important things happened under Vajpayee. One is universal and compulsory primary education. Only in 2001 did we bring this in. And I emphasize in the book that there were many Maharajas. You see, I point out that throughout history, never has the whole of India been conquered by a foreigner. Even during British rule, 1/3 of India's land and 1/4 of India's people were in the so-called princely states. They were actually treaty allies of the British. And those treaty allies in Travancore and Cochin and in Baroda, they had introduced universal and primary education in compulsory primary education as early as 1905. Nationally, we did that only in 2001 under Vajpayee. And then, of course, vital reforms, the GST, the bankruptcy code, and now most importantly, the labor reforms are vital to unleashing the full potential of India, all brought in first by Vajpayee and then by Modi in the last 12 years.
And last word about the current era. I mean, there are projections that we will become the 3rd largest economy in the world very soon, overtake Japan. It's still not good enough because we were number 1, right? I mean, that's your whole point about the book, right? That India was number 1. So Modi era, the kind of foundations that have been laid for India's economic resurgence to take back that, the ultimate position as the world leader. How hopeful are you about what is going to happen in the next few decades based on what is the work that's been done under Modi?
We are well on the path. I think it's important to understand that over the last 4 years or so, India's real GDP growth is 8.2%. And in fact, even the latest quarter is 8.2%. Our projection for the current fiscal year is 7.4. It'll be over 8%. It'll be closer to 9%. And the reality is that we are now growing really fast. Now, what is important is that we need to have a revolution in labor-intensive manufacturing. Labor-intensive manufacturing is the one area, apart from electronics, that we have really failed on so far. And the labor reforms that were notified at the end of November 2025, they create the wherewithal for India to really see a revolution in labor-intensive manufacturing that will generate millions, hundreds of millions of jobs. And if those hundreds of millions of jobs are created, then we can actually leapfrog to 10 to 12% real GDP growth for about a 10 to 20 year period. If we do that, we will become the largest economy in the world again by 2047. We also have a demographic advantage now. China's demographics have started deteriorating. Its working age population began to decline in 2013. We are not going to have that. We're not going to face that for another almost 20 years. So we have this final opportunity to have a demographic dividend that we fully capture through labor-intensive manufacturing. We are already very successful in labor-intensive services. We need to do even better in areas like tourism. But if you create a prosperous country through labor-intensive manufacturing that generates hundreds of millions of jobs, then that is the normal stepping stone. The stepping stone that was demonstrated by Japan in the last century. That is the path that we need to take. And as we do, we are likely, very likely, to achieve Viksit Bharat in 2047 as the largest economy in the world again.
Well, viewers, a fascinating discussion with economist Prasenjit Basu. Do read his book, India Reborn. I recommend it because after watching this show, I'm sure you want to know a little more about how India was number one in the world, how we lost our way, how we fell into dark tunnels, and then how we are now re-emerging to see light and to again regain our status as the greatest economy on the planet. It's possible. It may be possible even by 2047. There are some who are saying that even up to 2060 or 2070, India will remain only the third largest behind China and the US. But it all depends on what Prasenjit Basu is saying. If we are able to rev up the manufacturing, if we are able to do the reforms, the kind of changes that have been implemented in the Narendra Modi era, if they continue for several more decades, we will probably attain or regain our position as the world's largest economy and also the biggest trading power on the planet. Let me thank Prasenjit Basu for writing this book and for stimulating ideas that will go a long way towards making India a developed country and also a major world economic power again. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Viewers, the story of India as the golden bird, Sone ki chidiya, then losing its way and then regaining its momentum is an epic story indeed. And I strongly urge that you pick up Prasenjit Basu's book and read it. And more importantly, let us all collectively work towards this goal of restoring India to the number one status in the world as the world's greatest economy. Thank you for watching. I'll see you again next time. Until then, take care.